People often believe they want closeness. They say they want certainty, consistency, reassurance. But watch what happens when they finally get it. Watch how attention changes. Watch how curiosity fades. Because one of the most uncomfortable truths about human behavior is that people often become fascinated by what feels slightly out of reach, and strangely indifferent to what feels permanently available. Most people don't notice this happening. They only notice the feeling afterward. The silence. The distance. The sudden emotional imbalance that seems to appear from nowhere. But it rarely appears from nowhere. It begins much earlier. Usually at the exact moment someone becomes completely certain of your presence. That realization is uncomfortable because it forces people to confront something they secretly recognize. Sometimes attention isn't sustained by connection. Sometimes it's sustained by uncertainty. And uncertainty has always been one of the most addictive emotional experiences a person can feel. Think about how many nights people spend staring at a phone they claim not to care about. How many times they reopen old conversations. How many times they check whether a message was seen. How many times they tell themselves they are done thinking about someone, only to immediately think about them again. It isn't always the person creating the obsession. Sometimes it's the distance, the gap, the unanswered question, the possibility. And possibilities can become emotionally louder than reality. That's where the danger begins. Because people often confuse emotional intensity with emotional importance. The person occupying their thoughts the most is not always the person treating them the best. The person creating the strongest emotional reaction is not always the person creating the strongest connection. But emotional uncertainty has a way of disguising itself. It feels meaningful. It feels significant. It feels like something worth chasing. And most people don't realize they're chasing the feeling more than the person. That's the part people struggle admitting out loud. You can see it happen in small moments. Moments so ordinary they barely seem important. Someone who used to reply instantly suddenly takes hours. Someone who once seemed eager becomes slightly distant. Someone who used to ask questions stops asking them. Nothing dramatic happens. No arguments. No declarations. No obvious ending. Just a subtle shift in emotional availability. And suddenly their attention becomes more valuable. Not because they changed. Because access changed. People notice absence faster than presence. That's a painful truth. Most appreciation arrives late. Most curiosity arrives after familiarity. Most attention arrives after withdrawal. And by the time people recognize what changed, they're already emotionally invested in recovering something they once took for granted. That's why emotional distance can feel so powerful. Not because distance is inherently attractive. Because distance creates awareness. The moment something becomes less available, people begin measuring its value differently. Conversations that once felt ordinary suddenly feel important. Replies that once felt expected suddenly feel rewarding. Small moments begin carrying emotional weight they never had before. And eventually the emotional atmosphere changes completely. The frightening part is how quickly this can reshape someone's identity. At first they simply notice the difference. Then they start thinking about it. Then they start monitoring it. Then they start reacting to it. Before long, they are checking timestamps, watching story views, analyzing response times, looking for reassurance in places where reassurance no longer naturally exists. And something quietly begins happening beneath the surface. They stop behaving naturally. They start behaving strategically. They rewrite messages. They wait before replying. They pretend not to care. They rehearse emotional detachment while internally hoping for attention. And that's usually where emotional imbalance begins. Because the person thinking about the connection more often is usually the person feeling its instability more intensely. The terrifying part isn't the distance itself. The terrifying part is realizing how much power the distance now has over your emotions. A delayed reply can affect your mood. A short message can ruin your evening. A notification can create relief. Silence can create panic. And none of this feels logical while it's happening. It simply feels real. Painfully real. The emotional dependency often arrives quietly. Nobody announces it. Nobody plans for it. One day you're simply living your life. Then suddenly someone else's attention begins influencing how you feel about yourself. That's where things become dangerous. Because attention can slowly become validation. Validation can slowly become necessity. And necessity changes everything. You begin noticing things you never noticed before. They seem more excited around other people. They laugh harder with strangers. They respond faster elsewhere. They show curiosity toward people they barely know while conversations with you begin feeling repetitive. Those moments create a unique kind of emotional humiliation. Not because they are dramatic. Because they are subtle. Subtle enough to be denied. Subtle enough to be questioned. Subtle enough to leave you wondering whether you're imagining it. But deep down you know something changed. You can feel it. You can hear it in the pauses. You can see it in the effort. You can sense it in the energy that no longer arrives naturally. And that's when people begin chasing. Not necessarily because they want the person. Because they want the feeling back. The feeling of being noticed. The feeling of being wanted. The feeling of having emotional impact. Most people underestimate how much of attraction is tied to impact. Everyone wants to feel they matter. Everyone wants to feel their presence changes something. Everyone wants to feel they are emotionally significant. But when that significance starts disappearing, people often become obsessed with restoring it. Even when restoring it hurts them. Especially when restoring it hurts them. Because emotional investment creates a strange form of self-betrayal. People tolerate things they once would have rejected. They accept inconsistency. They lower expectations. They pretend not to care about things that clearly affect them. They remain calm externally while collapsing internally. And little by little, they become someone they barely recognize. You stop speaking naturally. You start speaking carefully. You stop expressing needs. You start managing reactions. You stop feeling chosen. You start feeling evaluated. That's when emotional confidence begins eroding. And most people don't notice the damage until much later. Distance creates another illusion few people talk about. It creates imagination. When someone becomes unavailable, reality often gets replaced by projection. People start remembering the highlights. The chemistry. The attention. The moments that felt special. What disappears are the flaws. The inconsistencies. The disappointments. The emotional confusion. Distance edits memory. And edited memories are difficult to compete with. That's why people often become attached to versions of people that no longer exist. Or perhaps never existed at all. The mind fills gaps with fantasy. And fantasy is incredibly persuasive. Especially when loneliness is involved. Because loneliness changes perception. Not dramatically. Quietly. It turns occasional attention into something meaningful. It turns basic affection into something precious. It turns emotional crumbs into evidence of possibility. And that's the frightening part. You begin feeling grateful for things that once would have felt ordinary. A reply. A compliment. a conversation. A small amount of attention starts feeling like a reward. The frightening part is how relieved you feel over basic attention now. That realization stings. Because somewhere deep down, you remember who you were before you started chasing. Before the waiting. Before the overthinking. Before someone else's emotional availability became part of your internal world. But distance has a strange effect on memory. People forget how secure they once felt. They forget how naturally they once existed. They forget how much emotional space they once occupied within themselves. And eventually the chase becomes less about connection and more about recovery. Recovery of confidence. Recovery of certainty. Recovery of identity. Yet the closer people get to recovering those things from another person, the further away they often become. Because some things cannot be restored externally. And that's where many emotional pursuits quietly collapse. Not with arguments. Not with endings. Not with dramatic confrontations. But with exhaustion. The exhaustion of trying to recreate reactions that once happened naturally. The exhaustion of carrying conversations. The exhaustion of seeking signs. The exhaustion of hoping enthusiasm will return exactly as it once existed. Attention changes before love admits it. And people often sense it long before they understand it. They notice conversations becoming updates instead of experiences. They notice affection becoming routine instead of exciting. They notice themselves working harder for reactions that once arrived effortlessly. And eventually they face a realization most people spend months avoiding. Sometimes what they miss isn't the person. Sometimes what they miss is who they were when they felt emotionally important to that person. That realization changes everything. Because it reveals something uncomfortable. People don't always chase love. Sometimes they chase significance. Sometimes they chase impact. Sometimes they chase the version of themselves that existed inside someone else's attention. And when that attention becomes distant, they begin chasing the distance itself. Not because distance feels good. Because distance feels unfinished. And unfinished emotions have a way of lingering longer than completed ones. Maybe that's why distance remains so powerful. Not because it creates connection. Because it creates questions. Questions people replay at night. Questions people carry into silence. Questions that survive long after conversations end. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all. People often spend years trying to regain certainty from the very uncertainty that captivated them in the first place. A cycle that feels deeply personal while somehow remaining painfully common. And most people never fully realize they're chasing the distance until they finally catch it. And discover the feeling they wanted was never waiting there. Only the silence. Only the memory. Only the realization that the chase itself had become the attachment. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.